Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Senator Dibble. You've worked long and hard on a very complex bill, and one that, well, you deserve Yeoman's Award for handling it. Despite your good efforts, though, I have a number of questions on the Real ID proposal. The reason I raise this question is that, as a background, this bill and its creation on the federal level was dubious at best. The issue of Real ID, as we might recall, in 2005 was passed in the dead of night in Congress, 2 in the morning to be exact, and it was added to an appropriation bill, a military appropriation bill that everyone knew had to get almost universal acceptance and a vote by members of Congress. We all know what that means in the legislative process. If you have an amendment that isn't necessarily popular, you try and add it to a bill that is assured of passing. But nevertheless, this was back in 2005. And in 2005, the Real ID demand on all 50 states was passed, signed into law by then President George W. Bush, and it began the process of a federal, what I would call intrusion or a usurpation of our 10th Amendment right. That means that the federal government is now going to do something that the states really should do and have the right to do. But nevertheless, we have it in front of us. One curiosity of the whole Real ID process has been in 2009, the state of Minnesota prohibited Real ID from being created, at least in the state of Minnesota, and we joined 32 other states at the time in our prohibition and our desire to say no to the federal government. We probably, as a side note, should do that a little more often with the federal government. But nevertheless, we now have the Real ID proposal before us. And since 2009, those 32 states that said no to the federal government have been quietly pushed back into compliance and submission by the federal government taking its club out and clubbing states into submission by simply threatening us by saying, if you do not comply with our wishes on Real ID, we will restrict all of your citizens in your state to not board commercial airline travel. Another question of constitutional rights under the free travel access provision found in the Bill of Rights. I suppose the federal government could say, well, we're not restricting your travel, actually. You could always drive to Nome, Alaska, or you could walk there and not use the most conventional means of travel. So there might be a loophole that the federal government might use in some potential case. But nevertheless, one of the more telling aspects of federal control is the provision found in federal law in the Real ID Act. And what I find the most dubious is that Congress gave the Homeland Security Director, whoever that might be in the future, a unilateral authority to change the purpose and function of the Real ID Act whenever that one individual decides and deems it appropriate. I'm very concerned about that provision in the Real ID Act. The reason I'm concerned is it has now removed the representational voice of the public, namely the House and Senate members of Congress that represent the United States people, from being involved in that decision. It is now solely in the hands of the Director of Homeland Security whenever they deem it appropriate. Instead of an elected body making the policy, it's now a political appointee and down to one individual, which I find to be an issue that we should never go into that direction and never give up our authority of the people we represent. Senator Dibble, I want to thank you, though. I seem to be going back and forth on this, but I want to thank you for opting to go toward the Homeland Security approved option of going to a two-track system. The two-track recognizes that if those citizens choose to initiate a Real ID compliant driver license, they can. And those who wish to take a different path, they can keep with their driver license. It's very similar to what we have now. It'll just be referenced on the face of the driver license that it's not for federal ID purposes. And for the purposes of travel, if the public so chooses, they can use a passport, or one thing I just learned at the last hearing, 15 other Homeland Security recognized sources of identity that they would recognize. Somehow, in the last 11 years, since the formation in 2005 of the Real ID Act, some of us just found that out, that there was an option that Homeland Security could recognize. Many states have already rushed into the Real ID Act and gone into full compliance. It would be a good question to ask if those legislators knew that there were options available to their people. But nevertheless, I did have a few questions. I personally think that this is the wrong way to go, and I never like to fully accept the option of going into federal compliance. It's an unfunded mandate, an unfunded demand of the federal government. Members, I put on a copy of a TSA blog. It's been handed out to your desk. And in that blog, it recognizes some of those options of, believe it or not, you do not need a Real ID license to travel. And this is put out by TSA itself. And in it, it states, if you're 17 or younger, no problem. You don't need an ID to travel. And if you're 18 or older, no worries, you can still travel. Going down 2 paragraphs, you'll be able to fly as long as you provide us with some information that will help us determine who you say you are. Further down, 2 more paragraphs. If we can't confirm your identity with the information you provide, or you're not willing to provide us with information to help make a determination, you may not be able to fly. Regardless, if you do not have ID, please allow extra time to check in. We would not want you to miss your flight. Now that almost seems friendly. It almost seems like just ignore all that Real ID stuff that we talked about earlier for the last 11 years. But I'm sure that the TSA, a division of the federal government, certainly would not lie to us. So I'm beginning to believe the federal government that we really don't need a Real ID Act to actually travel, which raises the other questions: why do we need it in the first place? One of the questions that I did have, I did raise the issue of the Homeland Security Director having the sole authority to change the function and purpose of the use of the Real ID Act card that we all will be required to carry unless we opt for a Minnesota driver's license, which means we will also have to opt for a passport or a secondary identification document from the federal that's being recognized by Homeland Security. But I did have a question for Senator Dibble, and would he yield for a question?
Senator Dibble, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Limmer.
Madam President, Senator Dibble, the last time we met in committee, I asked you a question. Actually, I asked members that were giving testimony from the Department of Public Safety, do we have in this bill a similar provision that allows the Department of Public Safety to act unilaterally as they consider complying with the Homeland Security Director in Washington, D.C.? I don't know if I got a clear answer then, and I was hoping maybe you could clarify that for me.
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam President. Would the author yield for a question?
He will yield. Senator Limmer.
Thank you. Before we conclude this discussion, Senator Dibble, I had one question. For those individuals who will not be using a Real ID driver license in the future and relying on their regular issued driver license, for some federal government purposes, they will have to have a different form of identification that the federal government recognizes. One of the most popular elements that the federal government could will recognize is a passport issued by the United States government. With a passport, an individual also has an opportunity to get a card that they can keep in their wallet rather than the whole booklet that's known as a passport. I have yet to get an answer from Department of Homeland Security whether or not that card that they issue is acceptable rather than a booklet known as a passport. Would you know the answer to that question?
Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Madam President. I believe I will. I'm 95% sure. I'll get to 100% sure for you, Senator Limmer. But yes, I believe the passport card for the purpose of entering federal facilities, boarding federally regulated aircraft, et cetera, would be an acceptable form of ID to use for those purposes.
Senator Limmer.
Madam President, I would just like to make a few concluding remarks before Senator Dibble makes his. Senator Dibble, you and I have worked on this for at least a year, if not a little longer. And one of the most frustrating aspects of the process of this trip through a federal unfunded mandate is the fact that the Department of Homeland Security refuses to meet in an open committee with the state of Minnesota. I know you're probably aware, Senator Dibble, that I have asked that question in every committee intentionally. I have asked for whether or not there's an official from Homeland Security who represents the federal government that is demanding us to comply with their demand that we have to pay for. Is there anyone in the room that could answer our technical questions? And every single time, there is no one from Homeland Security that shows to answer any of our technical questions in light of their demands. I find that not only to be disrespectful, I find it to be very difficult to make public policy, and I know, Senator Dibble, you have had the same frustration. But I do want to make it record known that there was a meeting back in September of last year where the Assistant Director to Homeland Security was in St. Paul, and they had a meeting. They had a meeting in September, and it was billed as being behind closed doors. Closed doors with just a small handful of legislators. I was one of them. Other leadership persons were there. Governor's staff was there. Homeland Security was there. But yet in the very same room, there were five or six representatives of powerful lobbyist groups that were also behind those closed doors having their little secret meeting. I was at that meeting too, And at least two of us, Senator Han and I, both raised the question, who called the meeting behind closed doors? There was stacks of reporters outside the door wanting to get in. And of course, the public never knew of the meeting as the federal government laid down its demands. I find that to be reprehensible. I find that to have no place in a free society, especially under the aspects that this particular government policy may lead to undefined and uncontrollable data tracking of our citizens. And then with the threat of not having our citizens have the freedom to travel on an airliner somewhere from one state to another. The other aspect that I have concern about is the data sharing that we haven't had a chance to talk about today, and that is the establishment of computerized hubs that every state can have access to gain information on other states' citizens when it comes to driver license records and any data that is deemed appropriate by the Homeland Security Director to be on your driver license. They also require additional magnetic stripe space for even more data to be collected than what is collected now, and they admit it in their government forms. The other area is this is nothing more than a national ID card. It may have a veneer of recognizing each state separately, but the content of that card is nothing more than a national ID card. And if it quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, let's call it for what it is. The other aspect is that there is a cost in the outlying years. The outlying years cost in 2019, according to the fiscal note, is in excess of $20 million, at least in 2019. So let's not try and fool ourselves. There is a definite cost to it. Senator Dibble, you did make a wise move on this to delay the infrastructure development because the state of Minnesota is going to be doing it anyway, and I'm thankful for that. I'm sure the taxpayers are, but despite that, there's still in excess of $20 million in 2019 that will be imposed one way or another on the taxpayers of Minnesota. Most of them, it'll just be an individual fee that will be collected on those that go with a real ID card. But not only the real ID card, but the regular driver license, they're averaging the cost out to everybody. So there will be an added fee. And then ultimately, members, is there a need to do this now? Keep in mind that despite the fact that they were herding all of the cats into the barn in the fall of 2015, it was almost into full compliance of every state to agree to go forward in their next legislative session. Surprisingly, in January 8th of this year, the federal government decided in a complete different reversal not to impose an immediate deadline. They extended it 2 years after the Obama administration would end its office. They extended it out to 2018 for the creation to make sure that you're in line, and full enforcement will not begin until 2020. At the very same time, members of Congress are beginning to hear from their constituents, and many of them are writing repeal legislation on Real ID, or at least to take the provision out that the Director of Homeland Security authority to individually change the function and purpose of the Real ID program in the future, at least that should be removed. So if there isn't enough reason just for a driver license to be a chosen entity in every citizen, we have the cost, we have the deadline that's not due until 2020, and the data sharing hub should surely be a concern for everyone We in Minnesota have wisely protected our data of our citizens when it comes to driver license information, photographs on that information. But now another government official from another state, let's say Mississippi or Arkansas, can look up our driving records, and whether or not they share it with others or not, whether they surreptitiously sell it off to some corporation for a profit motive, it's going to be very hard for Minnesota to enforce our privacy laws on someone else in another state. I'm hoping that our members give this issue of Real ID a little more time rather than vote for it today. And I'm asking you all to continue to keep the privacy rights of our citizens as a foremost priority in our minds. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator